It was another Monday morning. The sign on the door said private investigator, but the sign below that said wet paint, and I was saying yes to a third cup of coffee. It was cold and bitter, like a CISO saying they take security seriously. My partner was out of town looking into a Hollywood murder plot, but that was like a bad threat model. Too many actors and no lines of trust. When a text walked through the door, they looked as if they wanted to blend into a crowd, but they were anything but plain. They wore sunglasses and a hat with a brim the size of my tab at the local donut shop. "I'm being blackmailed," they said. "I don't know who to trust." I'd heard this story before. I knew to be careful about timing my next words. "I've got a public number, but I'm a private eye. I don't share secrets." "It's very personal. That's my prime concern." "I'll factor that in," I said, mentally adding another digit to my usual fee. "Only a finite field of people can ever know about this." I've been thrown curves before. I can be discreet. Still, there was hesitation behind those sunglasses, so I added, "It's secrecy from this point forward." They shifted nervously, but I could see we had reached an agreement. "So," I said, "tell me your tale, one bit at a time." Which means, this week, we chat with Simon Bennetts about building a scanner and a community with Zed Attack Proxy. In the news segment, Microsoft dumps a key, Grafana logs a key, URL parsers disagree, and old Linux kernel LPE, and more. Do something random, and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
Business Security Weekly is recorded on Mondays at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Each week, we address the challenges facing CISOs through our guest interviews, including former and active CISOs. Our news segment is focused on leadership and communication to better help security leaders translate and communicate security risks into business risks. Jason Albuquerque, Ben Carr, Tyler Robinson, and others add their expertise to the conversation. I'm Matt Alderman, and I hope you search for Business Security Weekly in your favorite podcast catcher and subscribe to download our latest content.
This is episode 254, recorded September 11th, 2023. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello,
Happy
John.
Monday. I'm tickled by the hat changes for those who are watching our video.
We are trying to tickle all sorts of things, tickle your fancy. I'll work on that. I'll work on that for a second. As I tell our listeners to join us at SC Media's Investing in IAM eSummit September 19th through 20th. This 2-day virtual event will provide insights from industry experts with a deep dive into identity and access management. Register now for a free event where you will gain cybersecurity knowledge and receive 6.5 CPE credits just for attending. Register today at securityweekly.com/IAM. Simon Bennetts is the Zed Attack Proxy founder and project leader. He has talked about and demonstrated Zap at conferences all over the world, including Black Hat, Java 1, FOSDEM, and numerous OWASP events. Prior to making the move into security, he was a developer for 25 years and strongly believes that you cannot build secure web applications without knowing how to attack them. Hello, Simon. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Mike and John. Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful to have you here because we wanted to continue to highlight tools, and Zed Attack Proxy is absolutely one of the venerable, I won't say, I'm trying to think of ancient, doesn't sound as good,
Yep.
as positive, but it is a relatively old tool, almost as old as, web testing it is. And so I'm really curious, what attracted you to do Zap in the first place? How did you start?
Well, like many people in AppSec, I think, it was a pen test that went horribly wrong. I was a developer. Team lead, developer, small team, developed an online service for a big UK FTSE 100 company. It was pretty security critical. Never had any security training, but we looked at security, thought we had a good idea what we needed to do. Got the pen testers in 2 weeks before we went live. Never heard that one before, have you? So
good timing.
It didn't go quite as well as planned. Within 1 hour, the pen testers had cracked the single sign-on system for the whole company. That was out of scope. So, technically, we were pleased they found it, but that kind of set the tone for the week. And at the end of the week, it felt like a car crash. I was like, okay, this did not go the way it was planned. What am I going to do now? Okay, I don't know enough about security. Time to learn more about security. How do you do that? Well, obviously, I'd now heard about OWASP. I hadn't heard about it before. So started looking at the OWASP top 10. But I like playing with things. That's how I learn best. I like getting stuck in. So I looked around for some open source security tools I could play with, and I wanted to learn. I also wanted a tool that I could automate so I could run it every night and not get embarrassed by the pen tests again. And I've always had side projects, so it seemed like a good time to actually maybe find a community-based open source security tool, get involved, see if I can learn more by doing something. Problem was, those tools didn't exist. I mean, there were some open source web security tools, but none of them were being maintained. So I played around with a few, came across this old tool called Parrots Proxy, ended up forking it and trying to create the community tool that I was looking for in the first place.
Yeah, Parrots Proxy, there's a name I've not heard in ages. And I think at the time, the tools that were out there were a Perl script that was like a NICTA or something that was just looking for some known vulnerabilities. It was just saying, does this path exist or something like that? Whereas Parrots and Zap are very different. They're, here's another ancient technology. They're a TiVo for the web, or a way to stop and record, pause and muck about with, and then replay, HTTP traffic. So this is really useful. And now tell us a bit about, you started to play with this tool, and this wasn't just for you. It sounds like for your own edification, learning this is fun, but this was also part of a community. So what was it like to just start writing for a tool that other people are using, or writing with other people?
It was weird. I mean, I've always used open source software, so I wanted to get involved in open source, but I never knew where to start. So I didn't actually start by releasing Zap. I started by giving talks to other people I worked with, other developers, other QA people. It was very much, do I understand this stuff well enough to teach somebody else? I wasn't claiming to be an expert. I just knew that little bit more, and I wanted to make sure I knew it well enough. Every time, the first question was, what tools should we use? So, after a few months of this, I kind of went back and looked and thought, are there any better tools I can recommend? And in the end, I thought, well, no, Parrots Proxy probably is the best tool for people at the moment. Although maybe the best tool is the version of Parrots Proxy I've been hacking around with on my desktop. So I bit the bullet. I made a few more changes. I did a rebrand, called it Zap, created a load of accounts so that if it went horribly wrong, people wouldn't know it was me, and released it. And it was and offered it to OWASP, and it was a surprise to me that OWASP accepted it. And I knew I couldn't spend as much time as I wanted to, because this was a side project. So I wanted other people to get involved, and I wanted a tool to be available that people could get involved if they wanted to learn the same way that I did.
Now, definitely want to come to the OWASP angle in a second, but a lot of this sounded like there was an education angle, and we like to talk about education, teaching others on the show. And there were two aspects here. One, just for yourself, how does this work? Let me be hands-on, which I think is wonderful. It also sounds like people are asking you're educating your peers, other developers, and they're asking what tool. How did you then bring Zap, or even Parrots at the time, as part of that education? And here I'm asking, I don't think it sounds like you say, well, you click here, then you click here, then you click here. It's more of you're explaining a cross-site scripting, a SQL injection. Tell us a little bit about that from smarter ways, or useful, good ways of using a tool-based type of education.
So I believe in playing around with stuff. That's how that's the fun thing. And so I looked for some deliberately vulnerable web applications. And at the time, there weren't very many, and they weren't particularly, the ones that were there either were online, but it's not always easy to get connections. So they weren't always available. They weren't always well documented. They were difficult to install. So I ended up writing my own vulnerable web application. It's called Budget. It's very basic, very simple, but it was supposed to be simple. And basically, I would get, I'll have a room full of, say a dozen developers and QA people and say, I'd install it for them on all the laptops and say, or on desktops in the training room and say, okay, have a play with this app. Just 5-10 minutes, have a play, and then say, what did you find that was wrong with this app? Usually they've said nothing at all. They played with it and they couldn't find. I told them it's vulnerable, but they couldn't find anything, and that was very telling. It was like, okay, right. Now we can have some fun. So that's when you kind of explain, here is Zap, and here is how you configure your browser. We couldn't launch browser at the time, but you configure your browser. You can see everything that's going on, and you can change it. And that was like, so all of a sudden it's like, ooh. And as soon as you show developers and QA people, more things they can find out, then they start getting interested. And then you start saying, well, maybe you want to have a look at this particular bit of functionality. How can you abuse it? What can you possibly do? And we'd have discussions, and I'll let them play around. And then we'd talk about cross-site scripting, SQL injection, all these things, and also business logic, because those are the fun ones when you're playing around with the business logic and you're changing things so that you now you buy something for a negative amount of money, and all of a sudden the shop owes you loads. All these fun things. And Budget is, it's a very simple app, but it's actually inspired OWASP Juice Shop, I'm pleased to say. So, it did its job.
So there's OWASP again, and there's in fact someone curating a project about vulnerable web applications. So, and you mentioned too, OWASP, you brought Zap to OWASP and they loved it. So tell us a little bit about those early days and what it was like to bring Zap and your other work with OWASP.
To start with, not much happened. I noticed 400 downloads on the day that we announced it was an OWASP project. I try and track everything, but that was a massive jump for Zap at the time. We get stupid numbers of downloads now, but that at the time it's like, wow, 400. But I just found more people getting in touch and asking questions and contributing fixes or developments. But in general, it just kind of a slow thing until I got an email saying, would you like to talk about Zap at an OWASP event in Dublin, one of the AppSec conferences? And that freaked me out. I'd never been to a developer conference, let alone a security one. And you want me to come to a security conference as a developer and talk to security people? That was scary. But it was one of those things, I love challenges. So it was one of these things, okay, I'll go for it. Went along, gave the talk, a few hundred people there, seemed to go down really well. A guy came up to me afterwards, can't remember his name, I'm sorry, it was all a bit of a blur at the time. American guy saying, Simon, love the talk, would love you to come over to talk somewhere in the States in a month's time. I'm like, this is Dublin. A flight from Manchester to Dublin is easy. I can justify that with my boss. Flying to the States, he might be a bit, Simon, we'll pay for the flights, we'll pay for the hotel, we'll pay for everything. Okay, I'm liking this. All of a sudden, it's like, right. And, you meet people and you talk to people and you just bounce ideas off people and you get into great conversations. So it really was the OWASP conferences, and I helped start the Manchester OWASP chapter. So these things really helped and were a great way to get information about Zap out, but also to meet people and find things out and get some great ideas and find new contributors.
And there's also got to be an aspect of not only to get the word out about Zap, but figure out what to put into Zap. Because on the one hand, I imagine, you're a developer and you were doing this, you're working with some of your peers and, features that you need, that your peers need because you talk to them directly. But I'm going to guess that's, overall a relatively small pool. So how did you start to collect, or what was helpful for you to figure out how should Zap grow? Where should, what features should be next? What kind of vision should there be?
That's tricky. One thing is, going to talks and listening to people and, some of the techniques they're coming up with and going, wow, I never knew you could do that. Wonder how we could, wonder what we could do there. And, so the lack of ideas has never been a problem. There's always been a million things to do. Having enough people to do them, that's a different matter. Parrots was very basic, even back in 2009, 2010. So there's a whole load of things I could see. For start with, it was just a GUI. There was no automation there at all. So I wanted a tool I could run from the command line. That was something that I wanted early on. So there's a lot of infrastructure, that needs to be done. We could tell, the spider wasn't particularly good. Zap didn't understand any sort of session handling, or there's loads and loads of things. So yeah, it's just a question of prioritizing all the things that you work out or see that other tools do.
So as you started
I'm laughing at prioritizing all the things because that's not a short
exactly.
list. But,
that's where I was going to go.
List of lists,
is as you started getting more interest from the community, and as you start having this list of things you're trying to prioritize at once, were you able to start getting more people to help, or was this still everyone's depending upon you?
No, early on there was a guy called Axel who actually forked Parrots just before me. So there was another Andy Parrots, I think he called it, but he was a pen tester, and so we chatted about it. In the end, this is way before Git, so I just gave him admin access to the source code and said, look, just contribute to his app as well. So he got involved. And in 2011, a guy called Ricardo, otherwise known as THC202, got involved, and most people won't know that name, but he has been absolutely core to Zap, and he's probably made more changes to Zap than I have. But he hates coming on these kind of things, so you won't see him, you won't get an interview with him, but he's been absolutely key. But yeah, it's gradually over the years, things have grown, and I think Google Summer of Code has been massive as well. So with Google Summer of Code, Google pays students to work on open source projects, and we've had some incredible students working on Zap and added some really key features. So some of the biggest features been added to Zap have been added by students.
And I know on the Zap website right now, you're even taking a survey, call to action, or asking for feedback about what should Zap work on next, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So we want input. We've got loads of ideas ourselves, but the general areas, there's so many things to do. What should we focus on? So go to zedaproxy.org. Towards the bottom, there's a questionnaire. So if you use Zap, or if you'd like to use Zap but don't for whatever reason, we'd love to hear from you.
Now, and to John's question too, you were described a couple great ways, some great contributors, Google Summer of Code, but in 2023, you've also moved over to the Secure Software Project, and tell us a little bit about that. What does that change? What does that? Obviously, there must be benefits there. How does that help the project?
So the big problem with Zap, another open source project as well, is how do you sustain them? How do you get people to work on them? So if it's a small project, you can do it in your own time. A lot of people work on Zap in their own time, but Zap has got to the stage where it's not possible for myself, or we can't get enough done. If you think of commercial tools that are doing similar things to Zap, they have hundreds of employees. Up until recently, I was the only one paid to work on Zap full time. So for about 8 years, Mozilla employed me in the security team, and I was able to spend 40 to 80% of my time on Zap, which was brilliant. But then it became clear, if Zap was to progress, we needed more people spending more time. So I tried working for some companies that were making money from Zap. I could work up, so for 3 years I worked full time for them, but yeah, in the two cases, it didn't work out long term. So it was and I've gone to OWASP and tried to convince them to invest in projects and work out a way to pay maintainers to work on projects. And it's just not OWASP focus at the moment. So software security project, that is a focus. We want people to be able to pay people to work on key open source security projects. So that's the key thing. So there's now two of us, both myself and Ricardo, work full time on Zap. We're trying to get, we have enough money for Rick, one of the other Zap leaders, to work as well. We're just working through that. So we don't want to stop there. We want more people to work on Zap full time, but obviously we need to get companies investing in the foundation as well.
And part of that, I think part of that investment from the companies is not only so that people can be paid, compensated for their work, what they're contributing for these projects, but hopefully those companies are also going to give you some feedback about what to work on? Like, as you said, you have a long list of priorities, but how do, everything can't be the same priority, and priorities get rearranged just based on what lens you're looking at them through. So how does, what are some other areas what either the secure software project helps with, or just having these types of connections to companies can help, or that you need more help with?
Well, we need more input generally on all of these things, whether it's what we should focus on or false positives where we're finding things which aren't really problems, false negatives where we're not actually finding these vulnerabilities. We don't have direct access to a load of real world apps. So when I've been working for other companies, that's been great because I do have some access to real world apps. But now we don't have that access. So we need companies to come along and tell us, this is how we're using Zap. This is what's working for us. This is what isn't working for us. This is where we'd really like you to focus your efforts. And, we can't promise anything, but the more, we know a lot of companies are getting a lot of benefit from Zap. So we need some support now as well. We need some finance and we need some input on what we should be working on and, more details of things that don't work right.
Yeah, and I think, tell us a little bit more about that need for real world apps. Now, and the reason I ask is I have a background building a web application scanner, and you mentioned that even to this day you're still part of OWASP, curating the deliberately vulnerable web applications. So if you have these applications with deliberately vulnerable, all these vulnerabilities in it, why isn't that sufficient?
Well, as you well know, deliberately vulnerable applications are interesting. They are often kind of a little bit quirky, and they do not necessarily reflect reality. So when it comes down to it, we don't want Zap to score really well against fake apps. We want Zap to find vulnerabilities in real world apps. That's the whole thing. We don't have enough access to real world apps, so the deliberately vulnerable ones are a good source. But writing vulnerabilities deliberately is hard. Tried it with Budget, and every time we create scan rules or improve scan rules, we're writing examples and things. But, it doesn't matter what examples you come up with. It's what's happening in the real world. Those are the things we want to find to detect. So that's where we need the input.
So I'm curious if there was a fun vulnerability class or a fun type of detection to write. And cross-site scripting for me can be fun, but it's also kind of boring. So I'm hoping there's something more interesting that you've been putting your attention to.
We don't have enough time. We don't spend as much time as I'd like on the vulnerability scanners. There's so much else to do. And vulnerabilities don't change a lot over time. But definitely the client-side vulnerabilities in modern web apps, that is very interesting and very challenging, because a traditional proxy like Zap, it's going to have, it intercepts the traffic between application and the server. But a modern web app, so much is running in the browser. So that is absolutely key. How do we know what's going on there? And so we've just actually released a new add-on, so we've got a couple of browser extensions, both for Chrome and Firefox. They're not perfect yet, but they are a presence for us in the browser, so we can actually see what's going on. And that's a bit of a foothold. So we're starting there, but there's still a lot to do.
Yeah, and I actually skipped over when you said you're doing improvements just in crawling, authentication. These are the things that are subtle and the less cool parts, because you don't map them to the OWASP top 10 or some vulnerability, but those are critical for people to actually use these tools, right?
And authentication. Ye gods, it's a pain. And it's absolutely, but it's absolutely critical, because if you can't authenticate to an application, you can't get to the good stuff. You can't test the real functionality. Now, with Zap, we've got really powerful low-level support for authenticating. So if you can describe exactly how your application's authentication and session handling works, then Zap can handle it. It can all right, if you're using two-factor authentication, you need to get those 2FA tokens to us, but otherwise Zap should be able to handle anything. And I've heard from a very big bank, or somebody who knows somebody, a very big bank in the US, saying Zap was the only tool, open source or commercial, they could get to authenticate to their apps. So we have this low-level support. but it's a pain. You have to really understand it. You understand how your application works and all its quirks. So what we're trying to do now is make things simpler. So we're actually getting Zaps to configure itself, trying to detect the things that we talk people through. It's not perfect, but we have this authentication tester in the Zap GUI, so you can try it out. You need to put in the URL and the credentials, and that's it. And Zap tries to identify the right fields in the form, fill in the form, identify the session handling, identify a verification URL, something we can test to see whether we're still logged in again. And if it can do all that, then it configures Zap. Now, if we can't do all of that, we need to know. So that's something where we want that feedback. So have a play with this and try it out and let us know where it doesn't work. We know there'll be cases it doesn't work, but what we're trying to do is we have the low-level support, we have the high-level support, and we're trying to drive that down and handle more and more weird cases.
Thinking about feedback, one of the things as a tool like this where you're really, you're never running it, right? People are running it out in the wild, and if you're lucky, you might get an email. Do you ever think about putting some sort of metrics in there, or telemetry, as some folks call it, that actually tells you automatically when those failures happen? Or have you gone down that path? Or
well, we do have telemetry. The problem is we are very careful. We're an open source project, and we know that our users and our customers care about security and privacy. So we only report things that are completely anonymous. So we don't have details of the applications people are testing. We don't take snippets of HTML. We don't get any details of vulnerabilities. We can tell the classes, the classes of vulnerabilities. We can tell if people set up rules for false positives. So we can tell the number of false positives that users configured for different types of vulnerabilities. And we publish these stats, by the way. So we detail what we're collecting. There's an easy way to turn telemetry off as well. And we publish a whole load of stats because we think these are useful for the community as well. So, which of the rules take longest to run? Which of the rules have the most false positives? All of these things we're collecting, but we don't have those details. So we know it's a false positive. We don't know exactly what it is. We don't know details of the, false negatives, so all of these things. So we get a certain amount of information. There's a whole lot of things. The real detail that we need to fix these things we don't get, and we can't really collect in a kind of ethical way, and that's unfortunately very important to us.
Yeah, part of what you've also been describing is that this was initiated from a pen test, and you've been describing the automation, a lot of different companies being able to do this, and a lot of things that you're doing, like scanning, just scale up what an individual could do. Developers can do this testing, but none of it has been predicated on replacing the human completely, replacing the pen tester. And I don't think that's a claim you were making, nor do I think it's a claim that you could make. So that's why I want to ask, is someone's approaching Zap, what are some good ways to be thinking, these are the vuln classes, this is how to deploy it, how to consider what it's looking for, but keep in mind you still need that human to look at this other types of problems that may come up?
Well, I think security, there's no magic bullets for security, as you well know. So it's always going to be a blended approach. And I think it's quite a good indication of what we used to do at Mozilla when I was there. So we would get pen test companies in, and we would get them to focus on particular applications. So we would go, okay, which applications are most critical to Mozilla, and which ones haven't been tested for a while, or which ones have had the most changes. But pen tests aren't cheap. So we were spending a lot of money with these companies, and we could do 2 or 3 a year, and we had quite a big budget for pen tests as well. So we could do 2 or 3 a year, and we had a lot of services, and a lot of these services were changing every day. So if you're testing a small percentage of your applications once a year, then you're missing a lot. So Zap, I think, is really good for scaling, and it's really good early on in the DevSecOps life cycle. So, you can, I know dynamic application security tools like Zap have a reputation for taking a long time, but you can do a baseline Zap scan where we do a 1-minute spider and we just do passive scanning. that actually tells you a lot about an application. There's a whole load of what security headers are missing and, what flags aren't being set on cookies. You can get some red flags there going, okay, there's this looks a bit dodgy. Let's look into more detail. And, you can do full active scans on applications, and you can find a lot of vulnerabilities. You won't find the business logic ones, but the injection type vulnerabilities and missing headers and all these things. There's a lot of things that you can find. So use automated tools in a good way. Don't expect to find everything, but they can test a lot of parameters on a lot of pages a lot faster than someone doing manually. So, I would expect a manual pen tester to still use automated tools just to get that coverage and just to get that understanding of application and go, okay, I now see what's going on. Now I can drill down and, these are the kind of parameters that are being used for interesting things. Let's see how I can abuse those. So, you get the breadth with automated tools. Don't expect to get the depth.
And that creative spark of how can I abuse this is the part that always appealed to me from pen testing. And Simon, you started off, I have a question for how would you recommend to someone get started in security today? Because you got started in security as a developer, by just taking Parrots at the time and creating Zaps. So, should someone go now and fork Zap and create yet another scanner, or what's the approach or recommendation you have for someone new getting into web security?
I think open source is a great way to get involved. Now, I would have got involved with an established project if there had been one. There wasn't, so that's why I ended up having to start Zap. And Zap is very much a community tool. We want people to get involved. And a lot of people have learned how to both program and understand security from contributing to Zap. But there's a lot of other security tools out there, so I think open source security tools are a great way to get started. But have a play around with things, play around with deliberately vulnerable applications and find what interests you. That's, when someone comes to me and says, I want to contribute to Zap, what can I do? My first question is, what do you want to do? What interests you? I don't want to give someone a task which they're not interested in. There's loads of things. Let's find something fun for them to play with and get, enjoyment out of and learn something. And then, it doesn't matter if it's not the main focus for what we're trying to do. If you're a contributor, you can work on whatever you want. There are no limits really. So that's the thing. Find something fun, have a play with it.
Actually, that's an interesting angle too, because sometimes with open source projects, it can be hard to get that new contributor because there might not be an easy, simple task for them, especially someone who's a junior developer. So, looking at the Zaps site, there's the code, there's documentation. I can imagine, I can start to guess a couple different ways. But how have you approached and made it easier to, engaging for those junior developers, someone who just wants to get started contributing?
Zap is a big project now. We've got, I can't remember how many, it's over 40 repos, something like that. It's fairly crazy. So, it's big. And, we have good first issues, good second issues, but we don't have that many because the simple ones tend to get implemented. But we have a very big contributing guide. And, contributing to open source project is not just about coding. There's documentation, there's testing. So what we do is we run Zap against a set of deliberately vulnerable applications every night, and we score Zap and we publish results. And we don't find everything. So there's a whole load of things. So we can go to the Zap website, documentation, and towards the end there's a list of tests, and you can find some well-known vulnerable applications where Zap doesn't find everything. So have a play with them. Can you find out, can you work out which one of these are still vulnerabilities? In some cases, browsers have fixed things. So, an application released 5 or 10 years ago may say it's vulnerable, but it might not be. But have a play around, learn about security, see if you can work out how to abuse something. And if you can, then do you think you could get Zap to find that? Give us a call. Get in touch. We can talk about it and go, that's hard for an automated tool. We can talk about it, but maybe you can find out a way. Or maybe we can go, actually, yep, you should be able to work that out. How would you test it manually? And then we can help you translate that to code. So, I think playing around with vulnerabilities and, picking one at a time and helping Zap understand them better, that's quite a good way in.
And it sounds like a challenging way in too. Some of those, like when it's not so easy to figure out, this is just a simple payload, simple response. Those can be fun challenges that appeal to those good problem-solving developers. So yes, hopefully you do get more of that support. Before we let you go, Simon, we always ask all of our guests to describe AppSec in 3 words. And I'm curious how you would respond to that.
Good question. Well, I'm going to go with challenging, rewarding, and frustrating.
I like it. I was worried that you're just going to say Zed Attack Proxy, but your answer is far, far better.
Probably the cheap one.
Well, Simon, we've covered a lot of the aspects, the transition from OWASP to SSP. You've mentioned a couple different ways that people can contribute, how to gather more collaborators. Any final pitch you want to say? Either some fun place that you'll be giving another presentation, or how somebody can just come and give you some feedback about this is one weird app that Zap can't handle well.
Well, on the ZedAttackProxy.org, we've got loads of ways to get in touch with us. We've got Google groups, we've got LinkedIn and Twitter, and we've got IRC. We're old school like that, so we should be very easy to find. So please get in touch, have a play around with Zap. But yeah, get in touch if you want. If you've got anything weird to tell us about, any vulnerabilities Zap doesn't find, or if you want to get involved, because we'd love to hear from you.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much, Simon.
Thank you, Mike and John. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for listening to us. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.